He stood in front of the door longer than anyone would have noticed, long enough for the silence around him to start feeling louder than any noise he had ever tried to escape, long enough for his thoughts to begin circling the same tired questions that had followed him for months, maybe years. Questions that never seemed to lead anywhere, but somehow always felt important enough to keep him frozen in place. And if you had passed by in that exact moment, you might have mistaken his stillness for patience or deep thinking, or even discipline. But you would have been wrong, because there was nothing disciplined about what he was doing. There was nothing strategic about standing still while life quietly continued moving without him. And the truth, the kind of truth people rarely admit even to themselves, was that he wasn't waiting for the right moment. He wasn't gathering strength. He wasn't analyzing his options with precision. He was hesitating. And hesitation has a way of disguising itself as preparation, when in reality, it is nothing more than fear wearing a more acceptable face. And the longer he stood there, the more convincing that disguise became. Because his mind was incredibly good at building arguments that sounded reasonable. Arguments like, maybe it's not the right time, maybe there's something he hasn't considered yet, maybe he needs more clarity, more confidence, more certainty before making a move. And each of those thoughts felt valid in isolation. Each one carried just enough logic to justify another minute of inaction, another hour, another day, until hesitation slowly turned into a habit, and that habit began to feel like part of who he was. Someone careful, someone thoughtful, someone who doesn't rush into things. But beneath that identity was something far less flattering, something he avoided looking at directly, the quiet realization that he had been standing in front of different versions of this same door for most of his life. Always close enough to touch it, but never quite willing to open it. Always telling himself that the next time would be different, that eventually everything would align and he would feel ready, completely ready, undeniably ready. The kind of ready that leaves no room for doubt, no room for fear, no room for second guessing. And that belief, that idea that readiness must come first, had shaped every decision he didn't make, every opportunity he let pass, every version of himself that never had the chance to exist. And the most dangerous part was that it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like caution. It felt responsible. It felt like he was doing the right thing by waiting. Because that's what he had been taught in subtle ways his entire life. Don't act too soon. Don't risk unnecessary failure. Don't step into something unless you're sure you can handle it. And over time, those ideas had solidified into a kind of internal rule book that governed his actions, or more accurately, his lack of action. And now, here he was again, standing in front of another unopened door, telling himself another story about why now wasn't the moment, why a little more time would make all the difference, why clarity was something you gather before you begin, rather than something you discover along the way. And if you had asked him in that moment whether he wanted what was on the other side of that door, he would have said yes, without hesitation, because he did want it. He had always wanted it. The growth, the change, the version of himself that felt just out of reach. But wanting something and moving toward it are two entirely different things. And that gap between desire and action is where most people quietly lose years of their lives without ever realizing it. Because nothing dramatic happens in that gap. There's no obvious failure, no clear signal that something is going wrong. Just a slow accumulation of moments where nothing changes, where the same thoughts repeat, where the same excuses evolve slightly but never disappear, and the world doesn't stop to point it out. It doesn't interrupt you and say you're wasting time. It simply keeps moving, and that movement, that constant forward motion of everything around you, is what makes standing still so deceptive. Because it doesn't feel like standing still. It feels like thinking, like considering, like preparing. And the more time passes, the easier it becomes to justify staying exactly where you are. Because now there's more to consider, more variables, more reasons to delay. And before you know it, the idea of taking a step begins to feel heavier than it ever should have. Not because the step itself is difficult, but because of everything you've attached to it, all the expectations, all the imagined outcomes, all the pressure to get it right. And so instead of moving, you stay, convincing yourself that you're close, that you're almost there, that something is about to click, that clarity is just around the corner. And maybe tomorrow will feel different. Maybe tomorrow you'll wake up and everything will make sense. Maybe tomorrow you'll finally feel ready. And that word, ready, becomes the anchor that keeps you in place. Because as long as you believe readiness comes first, you will always have a reason to wait. always have a justification for not moving, always have another excuse that sounds just logical enough to accept. And standing there, staring at that door, he didn't realize that the real problem wasn't the door. It wasn't what was on the other side. It wasn't even the uncertainty he claimed to be afraid of. The real problem was the story he kept telling himself about what needed to happen before he could begin. A story so convincing that it had replaced action with anticipation, movement with analysis, and progress with the illusion of progress. And as the seconds stretched into minutes, and the minutes into something less measurable, something more like a pattern than a moment, one simple truth sat just beneath the surface, quietly waiting to be acknowledged. The truth that nothing was actually stopping him. Nothing external, nothing physical, nothing real in the way he imagined obstacles to be. There was no lock on the door, no barrier in front of him, no force holding him back. Just a decision he hadn't made yet, a step he hadn't taken. And the longer he delayed it, the more complicated it seemed, the more significant it felt, as if opening that door required something extraordinary rather than something simple, something immediate, something available to him the entire time. And deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to explore, he knew that if he reached out and turned the handle, the world wouldn't pause to judge him. It wouldn't demand perfection. It wouldn't ask if he was ready. It would simply respond to the fact that he had moved. But acknowledging that meant letting go of the comfort that came with waiting. It meant accepting that the only thing between him and whatever came next was his willingness to act without certainty. And that was a level of honesty he wasn't sure he was ready to face. So instead, he stayed where he was, just for a little longer, telling himself that he was close, that he could almost feel it, that whatever he was waiting for was about to arrive, not realizing that the moment he was waiting for had been standing in front of him the entire time, disguised as a simple choice he kept refusing to make. Most people never notice the exact moment when waiting quietly turns into a pattern, because it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like thinking, like being careful, like giving yourself time to figure things out. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous, because from the outside, it looks reasonable, and from the inside, it feels justified. And he was no different. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was necessary, that there was a sequence to this process, and he was simply respecting it. First understanding, then clarity, then action. A clean and logical order that made perfect sense in theory, but quietly collapsed under the weight of reality. Because reality doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It doesn't pause while you organize your thoughts into something neat and predictable. It keeps moving, indifferent to your hesitation. And the more he tried to align himself with this imagined sequence, the more disconnected he became from the only thing that could actually move him forward, which was movement itself. And that contradiction sat right in front of him, without ever being fully recognized. Because it's uncomfortable to admit that the rules you've been following might be the very thing holding you back. It's uncomfortable to realize that the clarity you've been chasing is not something you collect before you begin, but something that reveals itself only after you've already taken a step. And for him, that realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as small moments of doubt in his own logic. Moments where he would question why nothing seemed to change, despite all the thinking, all the planning, all the mental rehearsing of different outcomes. Because if preparation alone was enough, he should have been somewhere else by now. He should have felt closer to whatever it was he claimed to be moving toward. But instead, he felt the same, stuck in the same place, asking slightly different versions of the same questions. And that's when the first crack appeared in the story he had been telling himself. The possibility that maybe waiting wasn't helping him at all. Maybe it was the reason nothing was happening. And that thought didn't bring relief. It brought resistance, because if waiting wasn't the solution, then what was? And more importantly, what did that say about all the time he had already spent doing it? It's much easier to defend a familiar belief than to replace it with something uncertain. And so his mind did what it always does. It tried to protect him by reinforcing the old narrative. Maybe you just need a little more time. Maybe you're close. Maybe you haven't considered everything yet. But this time, those thoughts didn't land the same way. This time they felt repetitive, almost scripted, like lines he had heard too many times to believe completely. And that subtle shift was enough to make him pause. Not in the way he had been pausing before, not as a form of delay, but as a moment of actual observation. a moment where he began to see his own behavior from a slight distance. And from that distance, something became painfully obvious. Every time he told himself he needed more clarity, he was really saying he didn't trust himself to move without it. Every time he delayed action in the name of preparation, he was reinforcing the idea that action required permission, and that permission had to come from a place of certainty that never seemed to arrive. And suddenly, the pattern was visible, not as a series of isolated decisions, but as a loop, a closed system that fed itself, where the absence of action prevented clarity, and the absence of clarity justified inaction. A cycle so subtle that it could continue indefinitely without ever being challenged. And breaking that cycle didn't require a dramatic change. It didn't require a perfect plan or a sudden burst of confidence. It required something much simpler, and at the same time, much more difficult. It required him to act without having all the answers, to step into something incomplete, to accept that uncertainty was not a sign to stop, but a condition of moving forward. And that idea went against everything he had been practicing up to that point, because for so long, he had treated uncertainty as a problem to solve, rather than a space to move through. He had been trying to eliminate it before taking action, instead of realizing that action was the only thing that could reduce it. And as that understanding began to take shape, it didn't feel empowering at first. It felt destabilizing, because it removed the safety net he had been relying on, the belief that one day he would feel ready enough to begin. And without that belief, he was left with a much simpler but far more confronting truth. There was nothing left to wait for, nothing external that needed to change before he could take a step. No missing piece of information that would suddenly make everything clear. Just a decision, immediate and unavoidable, to either continue waiting or to move despite not feeling ready. And that kind of decision doesn't come with comfort. It doesn't come with reassurance. It comes with responsibility. Because once you see that the only thing holding you back is your own reluctance to act, it becomes much harder to justify staying where you are. Much harder to pretend that you're stuck, when in reality, you're choosing not to move. And that word, choosing, carries weight. It shifts the narrative from something happening to you, to something you are actively participating in. And that shift is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of helplessness. It replaces it with agency. And agency demands action. It doesn't allow you to hide behind uncertainty or lack of clarity. It forces you to confront the fact that movement is always available, even when it doesn't feel easy, even when it doesn't feel right. And standing there with that realization settling in, he began to understand that the idea of waiting until you feel ready is not just unrealistic, it's a trap. Because readiness is not a prerequisite for action, it's a byproduct of it. Something that develops gradually as you move, as you adjust, as you learn through direct experience rather than speculation. And that distinction changes everything, because it means that the only way to feel more certain is to start while you're still uncertain. The only way to build confidence is to act while you still doubt yourself. The only way to gain clarity is to move through confusion instead of trying to resolve it beforehand. And once that becomes clear, the logic of waiting begins to fall apart, because there is no version of waiting that leads to readiness. There is only a version of waiting that delays it. And as he stood there no longer completely convinced by his own excuses, something subtle but significant began to shift. Not in his environment, not in the door in front of him, but in the way he interpreted his own hesitation. It no longer felt like a necessary step in the process. It felt like an obstacle, self-imposed and entirely optional. And recognizing that didn't immediately make him act, but it changed the nature of his inaction. It stripped it of its justification. It exposed it for what it was. And once something is seen clearly, it loses a certain kind of power, the kind that depends on you not questioning it. And now that he was questioning it, now that he could see the loop for what it was, the idea of continuing to wait started to feel less like a safe choice and more like a decision with consequences. Consequences that extended beyond the present moment into something much harder to measure. The accumulation of time spent not moving, the gradual narrowing of possibilities that comes from inaction, and the quiet realization that if nothing changes, then nothing changes. A simple truth that had always been there, but had never felt this direct, this undeniable. And with that awareness came a different kind of tension. Not the anxious tension of not knowing what to do, but the clear and focused tension of knowing exactly what the next step required, and recognizing that the only thing left to decide was whether he was willing to take it without the guarantee he had been waiting for. At first, he told himself that nothing was really being lost, that standing still was neutral, that time spent not acting was simply time spent thinking, resting, or waiting for the right alignment of circumstances. And for a while, that belief felt comfortable because it removed pressure. It allowed him to exist in a state where no decision had to be made, and therefore no mistake could occur. But what he failed to recognize was that inaction is never neutral. It only appears that way because its consequences are delayed, subtle, and often invisible in the moment. And that invisibility is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because you cannot feel what you are losing while you are losing it. You cannot see the version of your life that is quietly slipping away every time you choose not to move. And so, the mind defaults to what is immediately present, what is tangible, what feels safe, while ignoring the cost of everything that is not happening as a result. And that cost begins to accumulate in ways that are almost impossible to measure. Not in dramatic losses or obvious failures, but in missed trajectories, in paths never taken, in skills never developed, in relationships never formed, in experiences that remain hypothetical instead of real. And over time, those unseen losses begin to shape the structure of your life, just as much as any action you take, except you don't notice it happening because there is no clear point of comparison, no alternate version of reality presented side by side to show you what could have been. And that absence of contrast allows the illusion to persist, the illusion that waiting is harmless, that delaying a decision has no real impact beyond the present moment. And he carried that illusion with him for longer than he would ever admit, reinforcing it with small justifications that felt logical at the time, telling himself that he would start tomorrow, that he just needed a bit more information, a bit more clarity, a bit more confidence, always adding one more condition before action, never questioning whether those conditions were actually necessary, or simply convenient excuses that kept him in a place that required nothing of him. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into something harder to track, the pattern deepened, not through dramatic choices, but through repetition, through the quiet consistency of not acting. And what made it even more deceptive was that his life didn't fall apart. Nothing catastrophic happened. Everything remained stable enough to avoid alarm. And that stability became another reason to stay where he was. Because if nothing is obviously wrong, then there is no urgency to change. And yet beneath that surface stability, something else was happening. Something much more significant. The slow erosion of potential, the gradual narrowing of what was possible, the quiet trade-off between what is comfortable now and what could exist later. And that trade-off is rarely made consciously. It happens in small increments, in moments that feel insignificant on their own, but compound over time into something substantial, something irreversible. And the more he began to consider this, the more unsettling it became, because it reframed his entire understanding of time. It forced him to confront the idea that every moment spent not moving towards something meaningful was not just empty, but costly. That time itself was not a passive resource, but an active exchange, where doing one thing inherently meant not doing something else. And that realization brought with it a different kind of awareness, one that extended beyond the immediate situation in front of him and into the broader structure of his life, making him question how many hours had already been spent in this state of waiting, how many opportunities had quietly passed by without resistance, not because they were impossible, but because they required a level of action he had not been willing to take. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the true cost of inaction is not measured in what you lose directly, but in what you never allow yourself to gain. It is the absence of growth, the absence of progress, the absence of experiences that shape who you become. And those absences are difficult to feel because they don't create immediate pain. They create a kind of delayed consequence that only becomes visible when you look back and realize how little has changed despite the passage of time. And that realization has a weight to it. A weight that is difficult to ignore once it fully settles in, because it removes the comfort of believing that you can simply wait without consequence. It replaces that comfort with the understanding that waiting is itself a decision, one that carries its own outcome, whether you acknowledge it or not. And standing there with that awareness beginning to sharpen, he started to see his past differently, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a pattern of deferred action. A pattern where intention existed without execution, where desire existed without movement. And that pattern had led him exactly to where he was now, in front of another unopened door, telling himself another version of the same story. And for the first time, it became difficult to ignore the connection between his choices and his current position. Because if nothing changes, then nothing changes is not just a phrase, it is a mechanism, a direct and predictable relationship between action and outcome. And recognizing that relationship shifts responsibility in a way that is hard to avoid, because it means that the life he currently has is not just a result of circumstances, but also a result of the actions he has not taken. And that idea can be uncomfortable because it challenges the tendency to externalize blame, to point at factors outside of your control as the primary reason for where you are. And while those factors do exist, they do not account for everything. They do not explain the consistent pattern of hesitation that has repeated itself across different situations. And as that realization deepened, it brought with it a sense of urgency that had been missing before. Not the frantic urgency of panic, but a clear and grounded recognition that time is not something you can pause, or store, or reclaim once it is past. It is constantly being spent, whether you are intentional about it or not. And that means every moment carries a cost, regardless of how you choose to use it. And the question is not whether you are paying that cost, but what you are paying it for, what you are choosing in exchange for the time you are giving up. And for him, that question did not have an easy answer. Because if he was honest, the exchange had not been in his favor. He had been trading time for comfort, potential for certainty, growth for the illusion of safety. And while those trades felt reasonable in the moment, they did not lead anywhere meaningful. They did not build anything. They did not move him closer to the version of himself he claimed to want to become. And seeing that clearly made it difficult to continue justifying the same behavior. Because once you recognize that inaction has a cost equal to or greater than action, the logic of waiting begins to collapse. It no longer feels like the safer option. It feels like a different kind of risk, one that is less visible, but far more consequential over time. And that shift in perspective changes the nature of the decision in front of him. It is no longer a choice between acting and avoiding risk. It is a choice between two different risks. The risk of stepping into uncertainty and the risk of remaining exactly where he is and accepting everything that comes with that. And when framed that way, the decision becomes less about fear and more about preference, less about what feels comfortable and more about what outcome he is willing to live with. And standing there, with that understanding settling in, he could no longer pretend that doing nothing was harmless. He could no longer convince himself that waiting carried no consequences, because now he could see the cost, not in precise numbers or exact measurements, but in a broader and more undeniable sense. The cost of time that will never return, the cost of possibilities that will never materialize, the cost of a life that remains smaller than it could have been, simply because he chose not to move when he had the chance. And that awareness did not immediately solve his hesitation, but it changed the equation entirely. It removed the illusion that had been protecting his inaction and replaced it with a clarity that was far less comfortable, but far more honest. A clarity that made one thing unmistakably clear. Every moment he continued to stand still was not a pause in the process. It was the process, and it was leading somewhere, whether he intended it to or not. Eventually, there comes a point where the weight of avoidance becomes heavier than the fear of action. And for him, that point did not arrive as a dramatic turning moment or a sudden burst of clarity, but as a slow, undeniable pressure that built over time. A pressure that made it increasingly difficult to continue pretending that everything was fine, that waiting was still a valid strategy, that nothing needed to change yet. Because the truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how long you try to ignore it. And once you begin to see the patterns in your own behavior, it becomes almost impossible to unsee them. It becomes harder to hide behind the same excuses, harder to believe the same narratives that once felt so convincing. And that is where he found himself, standing not just in front of a door, but in front of a realization that stripped away the comfort he had been relying on. A realization that forced a question he could no longer avoid. A question that cut through all the noise and all the justifications and reduced everything down to something painfully simple. Do you actually want this or not? And it sounds like an easy question, almost too obvious to matter. But when asked honestly, it demands an answer that carries consequences. Because saying yes is not just a statement of desire, it is an agreement to accept everything that comes with it. The discomfort, the uncertainty, the effort, the repeated failures that are almost guaranteed along the way. And that is where most people hesitate again. Not because they don't want the outcome, but because they are not fully willing to accept the cost required to achieve it. And for a long time, he had lived in that space, wanting the result without fully committing to the process, telling himself that he would embrace the difficulty when the time was right, when he felt more prepared, when things aligned in a way that made the challenge seem manageable. But standing there now, with the illusion of waiting stripped away, he could see that the time was never going to present itself in that form. It was never going to feel convenient. It was never going to arrive with a sense of certainty that made the decision easy. And that meant the only thing left was the decision itself, unprotected by comfort, unsupported by guarantees. Just a raw choice between stepping forward into something unknown or remaining where he was and accepting that nothing would change. And in that moment, the nature of discomfort began to shift in his mind. It was no longer something to avoid at all costs. It became something to interpret, something to understand differently. Because for so long, he had associated discomfort with being on the wrong path, with making a mistake, with pushing into something that didn't fit. But what if that interpretation was wrong? What if discomfort was not a warning sign telling him to stop, but a signal that he was finally moving in a direction that required growth, a direction that demanded more from him than he had been willing to give before? And that idea reframed everything, because it meant that the very feeling he had been avoiding might actually be the thing he needed to experience, not as an obstacle, but as part of the process. And once that possibility entered his thinking, it became harder to dismiss the tension he felt as something negative. It began to feel more like a threshold, something he had to pass through, rather than retreat from. And thresholds are uncomfortable by nature. They exist at the edge of what you know and what you don't, at the boundary between who you are and who you could become. And crossing them requires a level of commitment that cannot be faked. It cannot be simulated through thought alone. It has to be expressed through action, through a willingness to engage with the unknown, despite the lack of guarantees. And that is where the real decision takes place. Not in the mind where everything can be controlled and analyzed, but in behavior, in the moment where you either move or you don't. And for him, that moment felt heavier than any he had experienced before. Not because the action itself was complicated, but because of everything it represented. It represented a departure from the pattern he had been repeating, a break from the identity he had built around waiting and preparing and thinking. It represented a shift from intention to execution, from potential to reality. And that kind of shift is not comfortable. It challenges the version of yourself you have become familiar with. It forces you to operate in a way that feels unfamiliar and uncertain. And that unfamiliarity can be mistaken for danger if you are not paying attention. But standing there with a clearer understanding of what was actually happening, he began to see that the real danger was not in moving forward, but in staying where he was. Because staying meant continuing the same pattern, continuing the same trade-offs, continuing to exchange time for the illusion of safety while nothing meaningful changed. And that realization created a different kind of urgency, one that was not driven by fear of failure, but by awareness of stagnation, by the recognition that doing nothing was not preserving his current state, but actively shaping it into something smaller than it could be. And that awareness made the cost of inaction feel immediate rather than distant. It brought the consequences into the present moment instead of leaving them somewhere in the future where they could be ignored. And with that shift, the question of whether to act became less abstract, less theoretical. It became something tangible, something that required a response right now rather than later. And yet, even with that clarity, the resistance did not disappear. Because resistance is not eliminated by understanding alone. It is confronted through action. And that means there is always a moment where you have to move despite still feeling it, despite still having doubts, despite still wanting more certainty than you currently have. And that is the moment most people turn back, not because they are incapable, but because they are unwilling to tolerate that level of discomfort long enough to move through it. And he could feel that pull, that familiar urge to step back into what was known, to delay just a little longer, to give himself more time. But this time, the urge felt different. It felt transparent, like he could see through it, like he understood what it was trying to do and why. And that awareness created a small but critical gap between the feeling and his response to it. A gap where a different choice could be made. A gap where he could act in contradiction to the pattern instead of reinforcing it. And that is where change actually begins. Not in the absence of resistance, but in the decision to move anyway, to take a step while the doubt is still present, to engage with the process before you feel fully prepared. And standing there in that space between hesitation and action, he realized that everything he had been waiting for was already here. Not in the form he expected, but in the form it had always been. An opportunity to choose, to either continue delaying or to step forward and accept whatever followed. And for the first time, the decision did not feel like something that required more time. It felt like something that required commitment, a willingness to accept the cost, to embrace the discomfort, to stop negotiating with the process and simply enter it. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked the point where the pattern could finally be broken. Not through perfect confidence or complete clarity, but through a single, deliberate act that signaled a change in direction, a move away from waiting and towards something real, something uncertain, something that could only be understood by stepping into it. He didn't transform in an instant. There was no sudden surge of confidence, no cinematic moment where everything aligned and the path ahead became perfectly clear. Instead, it began with something far less impressive and far more real. A single step that felt almost insignificant compared to everything he had built up in his mind. And yet that step carried more weight than all the time he had spent thinking about taking it. Because for the first time, he was no longer negotiating with the idea of action. He was engaging with it directly. And what he noticed immediately was not clarity or certainty, but resistance. A quiet but persistent tension that didn't disappear just because he had decided to move. And that was important, because it meant that action did not eliminate discomfort. It coexisted with it, an understanding that changed the way he interpreted his own experience. Because now the presence of doubt did not automatically signal that something was wrong. It simply meant he was doing something new, something unfamiliar, something that required adaptation rather than retreat. And as he continued to move, slowly and without any illusion of perfection, another shift began to take place, one that was even more subtle than the first. The world in front of him started to respond, not in dramatic ways, but in small, almost unnoticeable adjustments. A detail he hadn't seen before became visible. An option he hadn't considered revealed itself. A direction that once felt completely obscured began to take shape. And it wasn't because the world had changed. It was because his position within it had changed. And that distinction mattered, because it meant that the clarity he had been waiting for was not something that existed independently of his actions. It was something that emerged as a result of them, something that could only be accessed through movement. And this realization didn't come as a single thought, but as a pattern he began to recognize the more he engaged with the process. Every step created a slightly different perspective. Every attempt, regardless of its immediate success or failure, provided information that could not have been obtained any other way. And over time, that information began to accumulate into something meaningful. Not a complete map of the future, but a working understanding of what was in front of him. Enough to continue, enough to take another step, and then another. And with each of those steps, something else began to change. Something internal, something deeper than the external results he was producing. His relationship with uncertainty started to evolve. What once felt paralyzing began to feel manageable, not because it disappeared, but because he had experienced himself moving through it. And that experience carried a kind of evidence that thinking alone could never provide. Evidence that he was capable of acting without complete certainty. Evidence that he could recover from mistakes, adjust his approach, and continue forward without everything falling apart. And that evidence gradually replaced the assumptions he had been operating under. Assumptions that told him he needed to be ready before he began, that he needed to understand everything before making a move. And as those assumptions weakened, his behavior began to change more naturally. Not through force, but through alignment with what he now knew to be true. That progress is not the result of perfect planning, but of consistent engagement. That growth does not come from waiting for the right conditions, but from adapting to whatever conditions are present. And that understanding created a different kind of momentum, one that was not driven by bursts of motivation, but by a steady willingness to continue despite not having all the answers. And momentum, once established, has a way of compounding, because each step makes the next one slightly easier to take. Not because it requires less effort, but because it feels more familiar, more within reach. And as that familiarity increased, so did his confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from believing everything will go well, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle whatever happens. And that distinction is critical because it shifts the focus from controlling outcomes to trusting your ability to respond to them. And that shift reduces the need for certainty. It makes action possible, even when the future remains unclear. And standing within that new perspective, he began to see how much of his previous hesitation had been rooted in a misunderstanding of what it means to move forward. He had been waiting for a level of assurance that was never required, a level of control that was never available. And in doing so, he had delayed the very process that could have provided him with the clarity and confidence he was seeking. But now that process was underway, imperfect and unpredictable, but real. And that reality brought with it something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of engagement, a sense of being involved in his own life, rather than observing it from a distance. And that feeling, subtle as it was, carried more value than any abstract idea of readiness he had been chasing before, because it was tangible, it was immediate, it was something he could experience directly rather than speculate about. And as he continued to move, occasionally stumbling, occasionally questioning himself, occasionally feeling the pull of old patterns trying to draw him back into hesitation, he began to understand that this was not a one-time decision, but an ongoing practice, a continuous choice to act despite uncertainty, to step forward even when the path ahead was only partially visible. And that understanding removed the expectation of a final moment where everything would become easy, where doubt would disappear completely. Because now he could see that the presence of doubt was not a flaw in the process, it was part of it, something that would appear and reappear as he pushed into new areas, as he expanded beyond what was familiar. And instead of resisting that, he began to work with it, to acknowledge it without allowing it to dictate his actions. And that ability, the ability to act in the presence of doubt, to move without waiting for perfect clarity, became the foundation of everything that followed. Because it meant that progress was always available, not dependent on how he felt in any given moment, but on what he chose to do despite those feelings. And over time, that choice began to redefine his identity, not in a dramatic or externally visible way, but in a quiet, internal shift from someone who waits to someone who moves, from someone who seeks certainty to someone who builds it through action. And that shift, once it takes hold, changes the entire trajectory of a life, because it removes the primary barrier that keeps most people in place, the belief that they need to be ready before they begin, and replaces it with something far more practical and far more powerful. The understanding that readiness is created in motion, that clarity is earned through engagement, and that the only way to see what lies ahead is to step forward into it, not once, not as a single act of courage, but repeatedly, consistently, until what once felt impossible becomes familiar, until what once felt uncertain becomes something you know how to navigate. And as he continued down that path, no longer standing still, no longer waiting for a moment that would never arrive, he realized that the door he had been so focused on at the beginning was never the real obstacle. It was simply the first step. And the moment he moved beyond it, everything else began to unfold. Not all at once, not in a perfectly predictable sequence, but piece by piece, in response to his willingness to keep going, to keep stepping forward, even when the light only revealed a small part of the path ahead, because that was all it ever needed to do.